Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. We have here today a very special guest. Now, I'm sure as many people were back around the mid 90s, people were just enamored with the movie Titanic. A lot of people, including myself, that didn't really know a lot of history about the ship, obviously went to see James Cameron's masterpiece that made a gajillion dollars, which pretty much centered around the love story of Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. Not exactly maybe true to form, but it did bring attention, I think, to the disaster and the tragedy that happened. I myself looked into some books and other movies, the black and white movie that was made on Titanic. So we brought in a Titanic expert, if you will, here today, Bill Willard. Bill, how are you, my friend?
I'm fantastic, Wade. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you on, man. Because, like I said, this was, obviously, it's kind of like those things. I love when movies get made about certain subjects or certain events that maybe, people have kind of almost come to forget, have forgotten about. And then it kind of has a resurgence, if you will. And like I said, myself, I went back and looked, what's the old black and white movie?
Night to Remember.
Night to Remember. Yeah. I went and tracked that down, watched that, was kind of comparing the two, to the one that Cameron did. I was real big into any like behind the scenes. And didn't Cameron and them also do kind of like a little side film where they went down it and filmed some of the wreckage?
They did. They did. It was fantastic at IMAX. It was
Yes.
called Ghost of the Abyss.
Ghost of the Abyss. That's right.
3D IMAX. I got to see the whole 9 yards, and it was going into parts of the ship that had not been seen since 1912. It was extremely well done.
Wow. Okay, so before we get too deep into the Titanic here, how did you tell us a little bit about you first? Where did you grow up? What kind of, I know you actually do some teaching, so tell us a little bit about where you grew up, what you just started teaching, and then we'll get into how your, kind of fascination and fixation with this Titanic started.
Born in South Carolina, grew up in Asheville in Western North Carolina, and went to Clemson University. Played football there for a year until
you got good taste, my brother.
Go Tigers. Until ankle surgery ended that. But I was a high school physics teacher for 25 plus years,
Now, did you play ball at Clemson?
For a year.
Who was the coach down there then?
Danny Ford.
Danny Ford.
Absolutely. I got some great Danny Ford stories I'll share with you.
I ain't trying to age you now, but was that around when they hit their first national championship?
I was on the team in 79 and 80.
Okay.
And they won the first championship in 81.
Okay.
We defeated Nebraska in the Orange Bowl.
Oh, yeah.
Great win for Clemson University's program. A lot of those people on that championship team were friends of mine, and they worked real hard and earned a tremendous recognition for themselves, for the coaching staff, and for Clemson. It was great.
Absolutely.
It was.
Well, that's cool. Okay, so I'm sorry to cut you off. I just had to ask because I knew when you said Danny Ford, I was like, it's got to be right there. So I figured I'd at least mention it.
I know this is goofy, but let's see. I don't think, there you go. That's me in my uniform in 19.
With the sunglasses and all.
Those were the old photo grays.
Yeah.
That just happened to be there sitting behind me. I'm moving it over to a different part of the house.
Okay. So you said you were doing physics there?
I taught physics. I studied physics, got a physics degree. I taught physics in high school, retired from teaching, moved back to North Carolina. I'm teaching now at a college. I'm teaching teaching physics here, loving every minute of it. I started studying Titanic though in middle school. I read the book A Night to Remember that the movie was made from. That is where a lot of Titanic fans catch up with, oh, wow, this is how it all began. Walter Lord went to survivors and he got them to tell the story, and he would put them on index cards and sort of line them up so that he could tell what was happening at different times on the ship. Wrote a very well-written book about it. It was just a great book. Studied all that I could because it just captured me. One of the things that piqued my interest was there was a survivor named Constance Willard with the same last name. Mm-hmm. And no one in my family had heard anything about that. And so that was not something that I thought was a viable relationship there. I didn't know that I was related to her. Long story short, they found Titanic. They offered a chance to buy some Titanic coal from the wreck site. The courts did allow that. And so I ended up going to the wreck site as an observer for the 1996 expedition. Out there, they were trying to raise this thing behind me, the big piece, the largest hull piece of the ship. Due to great conversations with people that were involved, I was back out in 1998 and our team brought it off the ocean. It's now at the Luxor. In August 10th will be the 25th anniversary, and we're going to have a conference in Las Vegas. Anybody's invited. You don't have to be a Titanic enthusiast. You just come and learn more about it. Wow. We're going to have 3 days for a conference in Vegas, and the third day we're inviting people from the cast of the movie, of James Cameron's movie, to be a part of our experience. Wow. So I also found out in 2018, I went to this fantastic site called ancestry.com. It's very contagious, by the way. You start looking up who your ancestors are and you trace your genealogical roots back. I went to the battles of the Civil War. Where were my ancestors in those battles? And then I decided, let's take Constance Willard and trace her genealogy back. And her family, the Willard line, is from Horsmonden, Kent in England. That's where mine's from. So I found and traced mine back until we found a common ancestor. So she is a distant cousin. So I'm able to say that.
Wow. That's amazing. So, you can make that correlation. I tell you that ancestry.com can bring a lot of stuff to light for a lot of people. Sometimes maybe a little too much. You might find out about some relatives you didn't know you had. I've got a friend that happened to. But very neat in your case, though. So you're actually, have direct lineage to one of the. Now, was that a survivor?
She was. Her family came and lived up north and got into railroading. So everybody moving west in the 1800s made the Willard family there a lot of money. I think there was a Daniel Willard and there was an Ohio Railroad. And of course, that was something he was involved in. And I found out later, my son is named Daniel just by coincidence. And that's how he found out about Daniel Willard. My family went south because they wanted land. It was, when you live in England, that's one thing that you don't have is available land.
Right.
And so the Civil War comes along. Taxation after the Civil War cost a lot of people a lot of land. My family were poor dirt farmers during, before and after the war. They didn't have a lot of money. They had some land, but they didn't have a lot of money. And so my family ended up being mill workers. A long heritage of mill work in South Carolina. Wow. Tough work, but honest, hardworking people had to do it. And I've
been a steel industry worker myself since high school. So
you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Blue collar to the bone, my brother.
Amen. And they're good people too, because they work hard for a living. They're not going to get rich off of it.
Right.
But they make an honest dollar, and every one of them they're careful with.
Exactly. So now real quick, before we kind of get into, the beginnings of the Titanic, because there was a few questions I had about that, but that piece you got behind you, you said that's available at the Luxor?
It is. There's a Titanic artifact exhibit at the Luxor, and that is where this piece is on display. They removed a little lower section of it, and it's known as Little Piece, and it's in the exhibit down in Orlando. But it was attached to the bottom of this. It was attached about right here is where it was.
Okay.
And it went down about 6 feet or 8 feet, and they detached it because of safety reasons. They didn't want this thing to be transported on an 18-wheeler and for this piece to flop over and hit a car or something.
Yeah.
So they thought, for safety's sake, let's go ahead and separate that one edge. It was broken. It was already a separation there.
Now, I live in Charleston, South Carolina, but I visit Myrtle Beach quite a bit. Myrtle Beach, at a certain point in time, I would probably say early 2000s, 2003, 2004, at their Ripley's it might have been at the aquarium. They had
Ripley's Aquarium.
they had a little small, you know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
They had a
To
little
it.
small
Nice little
Titanic.
exhibit.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't huge, but you seen like a door to what would resemble like if you were downstairs, the water was coming in, or maybe it was upstairs. I can't remember, but it would simulating the water getting filled up, you know, and then obviously it would drain out and start over again. It had a few different things in there, but the one thing that I remember that I'll never forget is it had this hole where it said, you know, this was a replicated temperature of the
Take your
water.
hand down in that cold water.
Yeah, it was the replicated temperature of the water, you know, of the night when, you know, everything happened. And I stuck my hand down in there, and I'm talking about, dude, I couldn't keep it in there longer than maybe 5 seconds. I mean, at first, you know, you get that initial, ooh, that's cold, but I mean, then it literally starts to hurt. And I mean, I can't even fathom how cold it had to be. That, and you're panicking on top of it, so that probably doesn't help your breathing in any event. But I mean, that was cold. Now, I've always wanted to see some of those other big Titanic, you know, expos. Where would I go to probably get a look at one of the best ones in your opinion? Because I'm sure you're the guy that asks.
Those two places have artifacts that have been recovered from the ocean floor.
Well, see, that's not at Myrtle Beach anymore, though. They got rid of it.
No, that's not the Orlando exhibit. I'm sorry, the Orlando exhibit and the Las Vegas exhibit.
Okay.
There are two museums right now. One is in Branson, Missouri, and it has a sister museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, that has period memorabilia that are related to Titanic.
Okay.
But no artifacts from the bottom of the ocean. But those two Pigeon Forge and Branson exhibits do a tremendous job of telling the Titanic story. They do an excellent job. I'm friends with the owners. They're good people. They want to put a really good, honest story out there about it. And it's very
I'm
impressive.
actually going to Vegas about 3 weeks from now. I'm not sure when this interview will drop, but it's the first weekend in March. I'm going out there, so I'm gonna have to make my way over to the Luxor to take a peek at this. What other things do they have at the Luxor? If anybody's out there in Vegas, you might want to check this out.
When I went this past August, I went for the 24th anniversary to do a book signing, and the casino floor is the casino floor.
Mm-hmm.
So go up to the atrium, which is one floor up. They have a restaurant there called Diablo's. You got to eat there. Excellent, excellent food. Great price also, but everything was on the menu that I had was outstanding. On that same floor is the entrance to the Blue Man Group show.
Okay.
They are building beside it a Tutankhamun, King Tut, pharaoh type exhibit where they're going to bring in Egyptian artifacts over a period of time.
Wow.
I don't know how close it is to being ready to open. They were still doing the head of the Sphinx as I was there. But the Titanic artifact exhibition is on the atrium. Book your ticket online, save you a few bucks. Take your time going through it, and in the last room you'll see Big Piece.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll definitely have to check that out, man. I got the mob museums on my list to hit while I'm out there, and then now this, because when I realized listening to some of your interviews that was at the Luxor, I'm like, well, I got to go ahead and check this out. So let's kind of start from the beginning here with, obviously we got your background and what kind of got you interested in this. Now, there were a few ships built at the same time as the Titanic. Is that right?
Correct. The first of the three sisters was called the Olympic.
Mm-hmm.
Olympic was huge. It was luxurious. So Titanic was a little bit longer, more luxurious. And the third ship was to be called Britannic.
Mm-hmm.
So when Titanic sank, it changed and altered the way a lot of things happened. America had an inquiry led by Senator William Alden Smith out of Michigan, and he would question them as to why did people not know an orderly way to get into the lifeboats and questions like that. And from legislation from that meeting is why you and I were in school and we had to go sit in the hallway with books on our heads for the tornado drills and fire drills. And everybody that goes on a cruise knows the first thing you do before you leave the harbor is you have a muster drill where you go to the lifeboat station. All that came indirectly from legislation passed after the sinking of Titanic. The other thing that they passed then was that every ship that touched American soil would have enough lifeboat space for every member of the crew plus the passengers. Back in those days, the British Board of Trade said that 16 was the maximum number of lifeboats, but they were thinking of ships this big. They weren't thinking of ships that were gargantuan like Olympic and Titanic. So that means everybody had to double the amount of boats that they had immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a good thing. Those are things that happened. The third ship, Britannic, was never able to operate as a cruise ship because World War I started. So they turned it into a hospital ship. And it was on its way down to the Mediterranean to recover wounded people from the Gallipoli area, from the battles there. And it struck a mine. It was in water that's I think it's about 100 meters deep. And so it sank very quickly. It was empty. The doors and windows were open, so the water just went through it. It sank in less than 20 minutes. And it's laying off the coast. And there have been people that have made dives down to Britannic. And Olympic went on to the late 1930s, and then they scrapped Olympic. They took it apart and used the metal for other purposes. But
Okay.
that was
So the Britannic did. The Britannic did in fact sink and is still there.
It is still there.
Oh, wow. Now there's a story that kind of ties into that, but we'll touch on that a little bit later on. So I feel I need to address this, and I got a feeling how you're going to react to it, but there's been so much controversy over the years. What do you make of the, I guess, conspiracy that I want to say it was Olympus and Titanic was actually swapped and they sunk the ship on purpose?
Switch theory began in the early 1990s. A man named Robin Gardner in England came up with switch theory. And here's where it came from. When Olympic was launched, it was huge. It was a big event. It was a great event in Belfast. So everybody took pictures of Olympic. Far away Olympic, up close Olympic, to the side Olympic, coming toward us Olympic, leaving us Olympic. When Titanic came out, they were like, it's okay. That's, nobody's interested in the second.
Done.
I don't want to see the first one. But when Titanic sank, they needed pictures. So they take the Olympic pictures and say, this is Titanic coming toward us, going away from us, far away, near to us. They did all that kind of stuff. And so this whole generation of people looking at the news articles and things are going, wait a minute, that's Titanic. Look at the windows. That's the wrong window. So Robin Gardner prints this in his book that Olympic did have a collision with a ship called the Hawk. Crunch. Went into the side of it, made a huge triangular puncture, and they had to take Olympic back and repair Olympic. And it is there that Gardner theorized they made the swap. They put Titanic in service, fixed Olympic, changed the name. Now Titanic comes out, the former Olympic. That was Gardner's theory. Made 4 books on it, made a lot of money on it, and made a gullible bunch of people go, oh, switch theory happened. It really happened, and we have proof of it. And they show Gardner's books or evidence stated in Gardner's books. But several things that they don't have is, number one, they don't understand the photography issue. The second thing is, if you think about it, we have recovered artifacts from this ship on the bottom of the ocean that are marked with a number 401. That's Titanic's number when it was built in Belfast. Olympic was 400, Titanic's keel was 401, and they would mark these pieces. This is all for Olympic, so we're going to mark all these for 401, for 400 for Olympic, and take them out to Olympics issue. These are all for Titanic. We're going to mark all these with 401 and take those there. So from the bottom of the ocean is 401. It is definitely Titanic. A second thing they don't think about is you're talking 15 to 20,000 people in Belfast. that would have had to have been a part of changing these two ships.
Yeah, I can't
One
think that would be an
person,
easy operation. That's not like switching a VIN number on a car.
absolutely. One person would have stepped up and said, I know a secret. If you'll pay me money, I'll tell you my secret and get a lot of buddies to come in and confirm it. Never has any worker ever come out to say that.
Mm-hmm.
So
And like what you said too with the pictures, I think that was a big key thing was the portholes. There was a different number of portholes from one ship to the other, right? And whether there was a one extra or one less.
A lot of things like that. Yes. The promenade had a different covering than on one ship than on the other. There were probably about a half a dozen very noticeable differences to those who see it, who can have been taught to look at it, type thing. And the thing, this lady on TikTok that just came back out and did, it's an Olympic down there, not Titanic. I'm sorry, you're wrong. There's plenty of proof that you're wrong. And all it does is keep people stirred up. I have seen on social media people getting ready to fight others over this, and it's been put to rest. Mark Churnside, my friend Steve Hall down in Australia, they both have come up with excellent books shooting this theory down, and they are wonderful in the way they do it. They go through the claims, this is what really happened, and there's no doubt in anybody's mind. So either of those two books are wonderful. But
I mean, I don't really even get, like, obviously everybody likes a good conspiracy theory story. That's just something that I think people gravitate to. Oh, well, this really happened. But I don't really understand the benefit, because even if you swapped everything after that wreck, unless you thought the ship was just going to be completely destroyed, I mean, you're still, you got to plan a wreck that a ship is going to sink, that you're not carrying enough lifeboats. That'll probably be one of the biggest and still is one of the biggest disasters in history. I mean, like, you still got to put that into the fold, even if you do swap everything out.
Absolutely. And see, other conspiracy theories are like you just talked about, that it was sank on purpose, because it sank on purpose because there were so many rich people on board, and it had to do with the Federal Board of Trade in the U.S.
Uh-huh. Okay.
It was a nightmare of errors that were totally chance. Nobody did anything major wrong. It's just that if anything bad could happen, it did that night. They're going southerly to avoid the icebergs. One still made its way down there. If any one time they had moved the wheel from here to here for 5 minutes, at any point on that journey, they would have missed that iceberg.
Wow.
It was,
Now, real quick on there, all three of these ships, were they backed by like the same people, the same financiers? Was this a conglomerate of people? Was it one big mogul? Who was that?
This was owned by White Star Line, and one of the lead owners of the White Star, of the group that owned White Star, the International Mercantile Marine, was J.P. Morgan, who was an American financier.
Right.
But what other people don't understand is, even though you had the three White Star ships, you had the Lusitania, the Mauritania, and the Aquitania, and several of those from that company. Then you had a third company with 3 or 4 ships. So it's not like there was a unique hold by one of those.
Right. They didn't own the monopoly in luxurious ship travel.
Exactly.
Okay. So now getting into the actual Titanic, its maiden voyage was leaving from where, headed to where, for listeners that don't know?
Southampton, left April 10th, and it was supposed to arrive in New York around the 15th or 16th.
Okay. Now, how many passengers total?
16th or 17th. It's about a week. 16th, 17th.
Okay. Now, how many passengers total was on there?
Total on board was 2,208. That is passengers and crew.
Passengers and
about a little over 800 of those were crew.
Wow, that's a lot of people, man, especially for those days. That's a lot of people.
Well, one thing to think about, though, is Titanic was half full. Half of the rooms were empty.
Wow.
So it could have been much worse than it was.
Now, what was the ticket price back in those days for that?
Different prices for different levels. The steerage tickets, the steerage is where I would have been in third class.
Me too.
That's where Jack was in the movie. If
All right.
you know, 4 people to a room, bunk beds, they still had their little sink. Cost about £7 British. And, but the people that were traveling down there, there was one group that I've researched very, very deeply called the Addergool 14. And they were from County Mayo in Ireland, left-hand side, about halfway up. It's a beautiful little village. They have such wonderful people. They treated me royally. And all of them were family members to these 14 people that went on board. It would take them 2 to 3 years to save up £7 for their ticket.
Wow.
So when your existence, you sell the products you bring out of the ground and you put a little bit in the jar that you can every time you do something. £7 today is like $10.
That's crazy. 3 years.
Yeah, 3 years. That's how poor some of the Irish people were. Now, some of the upper cabins, the Strauses, Isidor and Ida Straus, were co-owners of Macy's. If you go into Macy's, into the 34th Street entrance of Macy's, on the wall is a plaque dedicated to Isidor and Ida Straus. And it was purchased and built, so to speak. It was made based on the employees. They loved the Strauses because the employees were treated so well. They donated money to have this plaque, and it shows both of their images, and it talks about both of them very, very briefly, but it's on the wall at Macy's. Their cabin, which was very similar to the Rose cabin, there were 2 staterooms with a drawing room in between,
Right.
was around $3,000, which is about $35,000 in today's money.
Ooh. Big money.
Big
Now,
money.
what are some of the notable, like really, really wealthy? Because you may mention that was, kind of fueled some of those conspiracy theories. That there was a lot of wealthy people on there. Who were some of the more wealthier people on this ship?
The richest man on the ship was John Jacob Astor. Benjamin Guggenheim of the Guggenheim Museum Foundation, everything like that, was on board. That's 2 of them. There were a lot of people who were into railroading and things of that sort. The Widener family from Philadelphia was another one.
What about am I mistaken that
was on?
Milton Hershey, was he on there? Was supposed to be on there?
Supposedly he had a ticket, but it backed out.
Okay. I thought I had read that somewhere.
If you know about the Biltmore House in Asheville.
Yes, I've been there.
Biggest house. Okay. My office is about a mile from the Biltmore House.
Huh.
The Vanderbilts were going to take that ship, but changed their mind and instead sent one of their employees. And one of the Vanderbilt reps was on the ship when it went down and did not survive. His name was Edwin Wheeler.
Okay. Wow.
So a lot of money.
Anybody else notable that was supposed to be on there that didn't go?
J.P. Morgan himself had an earache, and it is believed that he decided not to go. So a lot of people claim to have been booked on Titanic, but there's limited evidence to that.
Wow. You just think how something as simple as an earache, basically, I mean, you would think some of them would have probably been one of the first ones to get on the boats, but who knows how they would have handled the situation. Much like I've read stories of people that have, for one reason or another, didn't go on their flights on 9/11 that day that were supposed to be on there. Mark Wahlberg, very famous actor, was supposed to be on one of the flights and was late and didn't make the flight. Seth MacFarlane, if you've ever seen the movie Family Guy, or not movie, but TV show Family Guy, he was supposed to be on one of his flights, and his receptionist gave him the wrong itinerary. She gave him the itinerary, I think, for a connecting flight instead of that one. So he arrived late and missed the flight, which was, it hit one of the towers. So crazy how little things like that can alter your history.
It's all providence. It really is. Providence. So many stories like that. So many stories like that. It really is.
Now, when James Cameron done this film, they sunk a lot of money into this production. I remember watching some of the documentaries about it, all the, the money they put into it. He had a lot of stuff. Now, obviously, I know, the love story was fabricated, at least to a certain degree. But as far as like the ships, I mean, I've heard you tell stories on other shows where like he went and got like carpeted from the same either replica or manufacturer somewhere along the lines of like the exact carpet that was in there. I mean, he went above and beyond to get authentic as he could. There wasn't really a cheap corner cut here putting this together.
Exactly. I call it Jack and Rose on the Love Boat.
Yeah.
That the certain part of it, because the Caledon Hockley, Rose DeWitt Bucator, Jack Dawson, all that's totally fiction.
Mm-hmm.
It's the literary vehicle by which he was able to tell the story of Titanic.
Right.
And somebody said the movie wouldn't have done anything without the Jack and Rose part, and that's probably pretty true.
Yeah.
It would have been just a regular old movie that some people would have watched, but he wanted to do it right. James Cameron doesn't do anything halfway.
No.
If you notice some of his movies, Aliens, the sequel to the first Alien, was incredible. It was so powerful, so well done. The Terminator series the parts that he was involved in is always a step above and beyond. So all you can do is praise his attention to detail and his desire to be really, really strong in what he's doing. The lamps on Titanic, he went to the original lamp manufacturer and said, can you make me lamps from that same pattern? From the plates and things like that, can you make me those from the same pattern? You mentioned the carpet. He went and got several historians, one of which is a visual historian named Ken Marshall. Ken is a beautiful artist. And he got Don Lynch, who is a historian with the Titanic Historical Society. Don is a wonderful historian. He knows a tremendous amount of history, and he listened to them. And Marshall would talk about different details in different rooms and things of that nature, and Cameron would listen. And the funny story about that is the ship for the movie set is smaller than the actual Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons why is because of the height of the people that were involved. The tallest man on the ship was John Jacob Astor. This is the real ship. Mm-hmm. And Astor was around 6'3". Okay, I'm 6'3". Okay, so Eric Braeden, our generation will remember the 1960s show Rat Patrol. He was an officer in Rat Patrol. That was how I remember him first on. But he's been Victor in one of the soap operas forever.
Yeah.
And I think Young and the Restless.
Young and the Restless, yeah.
I think so. If I'm wrong, fans, I apologize. I'm not a soap opera.
You're meaning Victor Newman, I'm pretty sure, is Young and the Restless.
I think so. But he's done a great job in that show, and he was chosen to play Astor. And are you from the Boston Dawsons? And Jack says, no, actually the Chippewa Falls Dawsons, and he's, yes. Okay. Yeah. But Eric Braeden was only about 5'10". So everybody had to be shorter than 5'10". I was a member of the Historical Society at the time, and we received notice where we could audition for extras on the set, but we had to be 5'10" or shorter. And I said, well, I can try to hunker down as much as I can. And it wasn't going to work. A 6'3" former football player with, a weightlifting upper body and things like that, just couldn't hunker down to under 6 feet. It just wouldn't work well. But at least I had the option to try. I thought that was a great honor. So he did. There's so many things in the background. There's one scene when Jack is climbing back up to go see Rose on Sunday morning, which is the 14th of April. And he lifts a coat to put on to make him look like first class. And a young boy is sitting there spinning a top. The angle of the camera was identical to a photograph taken by Father Francis Brown from Titanic of young Douglas Spedden with his father and another gentleman, and he was spinning a top on that same part of the deck. So that photograph is recreated in Cameron's movie.
Wow.
And it just so happens the father is played by Don Lynch, the historian. And so he just went to extreme detail. The Marconi room, first class when they go down to dine, even the clothing of the band members. He tried to be as authentic as he could. So when I go, the first times I watched the movie, I was absorbed in the Jack and Rose on the Love Boat.
Yeah.
But I go now and I look at the details in the background. I want to see what parts of that ship I would have experienced had I been on it myself.
Right.
And
I think that's a mark of someone that has a passion for something, because there's movies I've always, in another life, I would have been a director. I don't know if I have the chops to be an actor, but I would have been a director or producer or something along those lines. So I'll rewatch certain movies, even though I probably know them by heart and can recite all the lines, but that's not why I watch it. I watch it to see little nuances in the background, pay attention to, even product placement, things that the average person is not going to really pay attention to. They're just looking at the movie at face value. I'll even try to catch bloopers or inconsistencies here and there, like when they make cuts, like, okay, well, his tie was moved over to the left in one scene, they cut to the girl, they cut right back, now his tie's back straight, things like that. So I get exactly
spotted one Saturday I've not noticed.
In Titanic?
I did. I went back to see it. This will probably be the last time in my lifetime that it will go back to the theaters. It's doing quite well from what all the.
Is it back? It started this week, right?
It started Friday.
Right. Okay.
Yep. And I'll give you a spoiler. It sinks.
Okay. It does. Okay.
But I spotted a blooper. What they have is John Jacob Astor died inside the grand staircase in the movie.
Right.
And Astor is believed to have been outside when the first funnel fell. It struck him. It's what the belief is, because when he was found, he was badly disfigured, and they could only identify him because of his cufflinks and his name in his clothing. And plus he was carrying about $3,000 in his pocket. So they knew it was somebody very affluent.
Right.
But the cufflink initials and the names in his clothing gave it away.
Now, as far as in the movie, the guy that, I guess, was he the designer? I don't remember his name right off the bat, but he was the one, not the one that said the ship was unsinkable, but the other one that, basically when he heard that iceberg hit, he said that the ship was going to sink. Who was that supposed to be representing?
That was Thomas Andrews. Thomas Andrews was an incredible designer. Let me get something real quick. I'm going to get a visual.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff.
Don't know if it was enough time for a commercial or not.
Yeah, I don't do commercials.
I had a teacher present this to me. She had a 3D Titanic printed for me.
Wow.
And what Andrews did was he put these watertight bulkheads. They called them watertight compartments. We would call them bulkheads. There's 13 of them all throughout the ship. And this was a new revelation. This was something they were working on. And what Andrew's idea was that if it got hit in one of the compartments, that compartment could fill up, but the walls would keep it out of the other compartments and it would still stay afloat.
Right.
He made it so that if you hit on a wall between two compartments, both of those compartments could fill up, but it'd still stay afloat no matter where that was on the ship. And that's what they could envision, is if there's a collision like this, boom, it's going to hit maybe on the wall. It
Right.
wouldn't be much wider than that. But what Titanic did was when it hit the iceberg did one of these numbers.
Scraped along the
and
side.
It sheared off the rivets, and the total opening, and they know this because of the rate at which the water filled the ship, is about 15 square feet. That's the size of your refrigerator door. If it was in one compartment, Titanic would not have been a legend. If it had been in two compartments, same thing. But because it was in 5 compartments, just like Andrews in the movie said it was designed to hold 3, even 4, but not 5. This ship is going to be at the bottom of the North Atlantic.
So
And
if it would have not hit all 5, the way he designed this ship was those rooms would have filled with water, but it would have been enough to keep it afloat and still going. But because it did hit that 5th one, it just went down in the front.
it would have been something like this. It would have been low in the water,
Right.
but it would not have gone under. They would have had to do some reinforcing. They would have had to work some serious pumps, but this does not sink. Carpathia comes along. The next morning, some other ships arrive. They pull off a lot of people, and they're able to tow this to Halifax. And with just a little bit of work on those rivets, the ship is back floating again.
Wow, that's great. Now, the whole scene in there where the guy goes, the ship is unsinkable, was that just something that Cameron put in there for dramatic purposes?
Bruce Ismay is the actor, or I'm sorry, the role that said that,
Right.
played by Jonathan Hyde. It was the press that really gave the ship. They said it was practically unsinkable, was one of the quotes. That phrase grew like wildfire. Julie Williams, who is a friend of mine, one of her relatives, the family survived. It was the Caldwell family. And her Aunt Sylvia, who survived, remembers a crewman telling her the ship can't sink, it's unsinkable. And this is early on before it struck the iceberg.
Wow.
So it was more of a cultural name than it was an advertising thing.
Well, I think
White
too,
Star never promoted it as being that.
I think too, what kind of hits it home is, he does bring God into it, and not to get too religious, but I don't want to ever test the limits of what God can and can't do. And that's when he kind of brings it out. He's like, God himself couldn't sink this ship. And then obviously we see what happens. I'm in no position to tell people who and what to believe in and pray to. That's your own decision. You'll have to deal with that when your time comes. But I myself would never test that theory, and I think that's kind
It's
of
like
what
John
drives
Lennon
home.
said the same thing.
Yeah.
We're even bigger than God, when he
Yeah.
was talking about the Beatles.
Yeah.
And it's done probably in the rash of the moment, in the heat of the moment.
Right.
But it does, like you said, you don't ever want to laugh in the face of God.
Well, you hear things like that, like him saying that in a movie, the ship sinks. That may not have been said in real life, but then what Lennon said, like you said, and then he's shot down later. So it lends some credibility that, sometimes just be thankful for what he gave you instead of testing what he can and can't do.
It does.
So the iceberg that they hit, what was the reason why they did not know that was coming? I know in the movie, I want to say, didn't they get, because it's been a minute since I've actually watched that movie, but didn't they get a notification that just went unseen? Or
they had been receiving warnings of ice. When a ship would see ice, they would go to the Morse room and and send out a code to tell everybody ice spotted at X location.
Okay.
So those warnings would come to the bridge, and the officer on duty would go to the map room and spot, this is where ice was seen, and put a mark on it. And this is where ice was seen. And they were tending to go more southerly. So they didn't see it as in, oh, this is directly in front of us, we're going to take our chance and try to ram through it. They didn't do that. They did not have a warning of an iceberg that size in their way. The night that it occurred, which was the night of April 14th, the morning of April 15th, was very calm. Now, imagine a flat sea. Now, normally what happens is you've got waves, and these waves hit something like an iceberg, and you're able to see the white of the water. Mm-hmm. And growlers is a term for low-lying icebergs. They call those growlers. So you've got the icebergs that are very tall, sticking out of the water. You've got the growlers, which are very low to the water, but you're able to see where the water line is because of those growlers. So the crew up in the crow's nest, it was Frederick Fleet and it was Reginald Lee. They were up there And by the time they saw this shadow, they turned around, they immediately rang back to the bridge, iceberg right ahead. And they turned the wheel, if you got something to your right, you turn the wheel to the left to try to avoid it.
Mhm.
But when you're dealing with something that weighs that many thousand tons,
Yeah.
it's not going to turn on a dime.
No, sir.
It's
Not a
going to
bit.
take it a while.
Now, let me ask you a question. By them doing that, did that possibly lend an assistance for it scraping along the side? Would they have been better to hit something more head on and let the front of the ship take the brunt of it? I mean, obviously, I understand that's, even though it's a ship like that and it's going to take it a minute to even adjust to whatever you may do. Just like if you're driving in a car and you see a deer in front of you, your instinct is going to be jerk whichever way you have the best chance of possibly not hitting it.
Absolutely.
Them doing that, did it lend itself, a little bit more, I guess, fault of that scraping along the side would have been better to hit head on?
The head on theory was proposed some time ago, and it was debated quite a bit. One of the things that people don't realize when they think about Titanic's engineering is they had a forward expansion joint. They also had a middle expansion joint and had another expansion joint. And these joints, you think of something like this riding waves, it's going to put extra stress.
Yeah.
So these expansion joints gave them a little bit of this.
Allowed it to flex a little.
A little bit. And it's been modeled. They've taken some computer modeling and some actual physical models, and they've run this ship head on into an iceberg. And what ends up happening is that that expansion joint crushes. Now, what that does is that means it opens up an opening right here that will fill up the rest of the ship.
Mm.
And there's been a thought that if it's going to do that, then the ship may just capsize.
Flip over.
And if it does that, of course, there's no way to save it at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the modeling and the experimentation that they've done by forensics experts, they've said that no, that a head-on collision may have delayed it some, but it would not have avoided the foundry.
So either way, with the given circumstances they had, there was really no way to avoid the disaster. And in the way that it did happen, probably got a few more lives saved than the other.
Could have. That's it. We can always be a quarterback, an armchair quarterback,
Right.
and say, well, this is what I would have done. But like you said a minute ago, unless you put yourself in that position, when you're driving a car and a deer does jump out in front of you, okay, tell me what you were going to do now. You said you talked real cool about this. Now,
Yeah.
what would you have done? It's a totally different world when your adrenaline skyrockets and you've got to make a split-second decision without contemplating choices and options.
Yeah.
And the first thing he tried to do is exactly what you said. Let's turn and avoid it.
Yeah.
Hard to starboard. And so as the ship started turning, instead of hitting it and bouncing, it just lightly grazed down the side of it.
Mm. Wow.
Just, if they had had another couple of 100 yards, maybe.
Yeah.
And, maybe another 300 to 400 yards, it would have missed it. There has been a proposed theory called grounding theory, which says that the iceberg had a ledge, and that when Titanic was coming, it sort of ran up on this ledge, and it caused the iceberg to tilt into it, and that this ledge was underwater, and that it scraped here and did some damage here as well. Grounding theory has some proponents, some people that support it.
Wow. Yeah, not something you could. Only way to really test that is now getting down to the bottom of the wreckage and doing. I'm assuming.
That's it. You have to look at the bottom. Is there iceberg damage? Are there dents and digs in the steel hull that were caused by the ice? That's about the only thing you can do.
No.
And you're talking 110 years plus. It's 113 years, 111 years this time. Will it still even be there in good enough shape to look at?
To even investigate. Now, in the movie, it showed, unfortunately, that some of the people in steerage, because there was such a commotion going on, were actually locked down there and didn't able to get out, weren't able to get out of that area. So essentially, they died a really horrible death Is that accurate? Did that really happen, or do you have that knowledge?
The general belief is that there were some gates that were locked, some of the main gates, and they were not unlocked until it was too late.
Okay.
One historian had a theory and wants to look at those gates and find them in some parts, that if they're still there, were they locked with a key lock or were they latched? Either way, they were not allowed back up on it. A lot of the third class survivors had to find an alternative way to come up, and there was actually one group that broke down a gate in order to climb through. So Cameron used that in the Jack and Rose and Tommy and Fabrizio getting up to the boat deck.
Mm-hmm.
So
and then two, one of them, I think which one got shot? One of them got shot when they were trying to come through, right?
Tommy Ryan in the movie.
Yeah.
We know due to testimony from the survivors that there were two officers that fired their weapons. But there is no report that a weapon was fired at anyone. Most of it was pow, pow, pow. Keep
Kind
order
of a
here.
crowd
Keep
control.
order.
Yeah.
Yeah, crowd control. There was an eyewitness that said that an officer shot himself. That officer was not identified. They could not identify which one it was. Cameron put that in the movie, and the Murdoch family, current family, were not real happy about that, because that made Murdoch, first of all, he took a bribe from Hockley, and then he shot himself. And so, but they said that there's no evidence that he did that. That's making him look really bad. And so Cameron did something nice. There was a school, I believe I think it was a school that the family supported, and he made a very nice donation to that school as a way of saying, I hope this helps.
Right.
And the family thought that was a nice thing that he did for the school. So I don't think it was Murdoch myself, being a historian. I think it may have been Chief Officer Wild. Usually the people that traveled on the ships in those days knew the top one or two people of the ship, because everybody knew who Captain Smith was. I would think they would know who Murdoch was, because he was going to take over that ship on its next voyage. Now, after it got back to England, Smith was retiring. So
that's what I was curious of. I think they even mentioned that in the movie, that was his last run or something like that. I was curious if that was accurate too.
That is correct. He had never had any incidents whatsoever, any trouble in his entire career with White Star.
Wow, that's amazing. Now the visuals in that movie, when the ship begins to sink and then it starts to rip apart, that's often been debated as well. But I think it's pretty much been proven that it did actually tear apart in two pieces, but didn't they land quite some distance away from each other?
About a quarter of a mile.
Mile. And that's the reason, because when that first one fell, obviously in the movie, it's going way up and then it falls back down. Well, when that piece completely separates, it's going to go straight down. And the other piece does bob for a little bit, and then it kind of goes, obviously the current's going to carry it just a little bit.
Well, the first piece, the bow, when it went down at an angle. So it's planing down through the water, sort of, at an angle. So it came down and it landed crunch. The stern, when it finally sank, it's showing, I need a green screen for my blue ship. When it finally went down, it did a corkscrew on the way down. And it started to make bigger circles. And they have estimated that based on the pattern of the debris around it. And then it came to rest on the ground, and all the debris came down and landed around it and things like that. And they're facing in opposite directions. The stern is facing away and the bow's facing the opposite direction.
Wow. Are you good on time?
I am.
Okay, because there's just so much more I want to get to, and I don't want to hold you if you got something you got to do. Because this is fascinating stuff. I'm really intrigued. So when it drops down, how accurate do you think that is to what Cameron put in the movie? Because I remember that even to this day with CGI advancements and green screen advancements. And obviously I know they had some of that stuff back then, but that movie still holds water. Those scenes, sometimes when I put it on there, not to, diminish the rest of the movie, but I'll put it on when it starts to sink and just imagine, myself in that predicament. What would I do? Like a lot of those guys, go to the end, hang on to it last second as you can. What do you think that's pretty true to form, or probably how it really happened?
The sinking.
Yes.
One of the things Cameron did, Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:37. It foundered. It finally went beneath the waves at 2:20 a.m. So that is 2 hours and 43 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
If you take your stopwatch when it hits the iceberg in the movie, and from the moment the ship goes down under Jack and Rose, it's 2 hours and 43 minutes. He edited so that it was the exact same time of the sinking. That is cinematic brilliance. That is a realistic how long it took to go down. Now,
What was the runtime of that movie?
Say again?
What was the runtime of that movie?
3 hours and 15 minutes, 3 hours and something like that.
I had no idea he edited it to the exact time. That's amazing.
He cut some scenes out of it that people thought he should have left in for the historical power of the scenes. We had a conference in 1999, and one of the actors from the movie came to our conference. Bernard Fox was the actor. Now, he played Archibald Gracie in this movie. Why don't you give the boy a little something for his trouble? Women in machinery don't mix.
Yeah.
Let's go have our brandies now. This was Archibald Gracie, and he played Gracie, but he was also in A Night to Remember as Frederick Fleet, who spotted the iceberg. And one of the scenes they cut out, to me, I've seen it, almost had me in tears. And what Cameron had designed is on board Carpathia, when they've recovered all these lifeboats. And here they're recovering one with Officer Lowe on it. So you've got Bernard Fox, who is Archibald Gracie, and behind him is Officer Lowe, played by Johan Griffith. Everybody knows, Mr. Fantastic in the Fantastic Four movies, Horatio Hornblower in the A&E special, which was magnificent. But as these men are coming on Carpathia, there is a gauntlet of all these women, haggard, blankets around them, crying, "Have you seen my husband? Have you seen my husband?" And the look on those men's faces, "Why did you survive and my husband didn't? Where's my husband?" And they have to go through that. That right there just tore my heart out. Oh, mercy. It was such a painful scene to watch. It was so powerful. But that's one of the scenes that was important. I wish he would have kept in.
Wow.
Another scene they cut out was the second officer, C.H. Lightoller. Lightoller is one of my heroes. One thing that Lightoller did after he survived Titanic was in the late 1930s, the British troops at Dunkirk were trapped. They couldn't get in to rescue them. And they've got all these troops. If you watch the movie Dunkirk a few years ago, they'll show this. There was a main character played by Mark Rylance on his little powered boat, and that person is designed to be C.H. Lightoller. They designed and organized a plan called Operation Dynamo, where they contacted all these people up and down the coast and said, "We need your boat. We need to go rescue our British troops." And on one morning, this armada of over 600 private vessels, can you imagine over 600? Some of them had sails, some of them had motors. They're off and they're going. And as soon as they pull up on the beach, they're filling them with troops, and some of the other troops are pushing them back. They turn around and head back across the English Channel. Another boat comes in its place, and they rescued a huge number. I thought, Lightoller survived to be a part of that.
Yeah.
And his boat, he took his boat and he said, "Follow me, boys. Let's head off." And some other ones were right behind him. Lightoller survived because he was pulled into an air vent. Now, in reality, that's the end, pretty much. But at that same time, down below, there was an explosion, probably a boiler. But when it exploded, that air vent blew air out, and he was propelled in the air and splashed in the water a little bit away from the ship.
Holy
So
cow.
he comes back up to the surface and he gets his senses about him, which didn't take long in that cold water. You put
Yeah.
your hand in it, you know what that's like. He looks around and the bow has already been sinking so quickly, he's not close to the ship anymore. So he turns around and he looks, and there's an upside down lifeboat, and people are fighting to keep everybody off of it. There's a group of them, and he swims over and he takes command of that lifeboat. And he gets himself up, and they get this whole line of people standing on the bottom of this lifeboat. And he gets them to hold their arms out. And he says, lean a little bit to the right, lean a little bit to the right, hold it right there. Okay, boys, back to the left, just a touch, hold it. He kept them moving back and forth so that lifeboat would not turn over. Meanwhile, people are hanging on to the legs and to the sides of that while they're still partly in the water to try to save themselves. They did that for a while until another boat came over to help them, and they offloaded everybody into the other boat. But that is what kind of a hero he ended up being. And you see what he did afterwards. He saved some 40 to 50 people, I think, on his boat. I think he made 2 trips. I have to check that. I know that he did a full load the first time, but because of the motorized vessels, they could, come over twice as fast as the sailing vessels could. But there's so many of those stories that we only know because, number one, we've got a lot of great historians who have researched these things with family members, but we've learned a lot from the wreck itself, from things that we found in the wreck.
So the physical aspects of the sinking, do you agree with how it went down in the movie as far as like, how it broke and how the last part stayed afloat? Do you think that kind of was true to form how it happened, or?
I would think that generally is pretty close to being what may have happened.
Yeah.
A lot of people thought that it stayed in one piece, that it was on the bottom of the ocean. Clive Cussler wrote a book in the 1970s called Raise the Titanic, where it was believed to be in one piece. And of course, it's great when the ship comes up and they're able to raise the Titanic in that 1980 movie. I loved it. I still love that movie, even though it was totally fiction. Some others said that it was breaking apart and they saw it break apart, but they didn't know for sure until 1985, till they found it. And once they found it, I think what Cameron portrayed was very close to being what could have happened for sure.
And, I think as a movie watcher, you put yourself in that position. Had I been able to maneuver around that ship, not been able to get on one of the lifeboats, and had to basically do what they did, stay on it as long as possible. And then you don't even think about when it goes under. It's going to suck you down with it. That suction of that ship coming down, you're basically in the tail end of that. It is going to take you down right along with it if you're not careful.
Well, Charles Joffin, who was one of the bakers, was on the back of the ship. He really was on the back of the ship. He had had a little bit of scotch.
I don't blame him.
You remember him in A Night to Remember. He's the one who kept taking the drinks, is how they portrayed him in that movie.
Well, they had that one. Was that the one guy that was on there with him? He was taking a drink out of his flask.
He took a drink out of the flask.
Yeah.
That man was played by Liam Toohey, and Liam played the Joffin in this current movie. But Joffin's testimony is that he was able to ride the ship until it went into the water, and then he stepped off, and it did not even get his hair wet. He did not go under the water. Really? He said it was that peaceful of a sinking underneath it.
Wow.
So you've got Cameron's literary, with all the turmoil and people being pulled under, you think it's going to provide a suction and pull people down. But then you have Joffin's testimony where he was able to step off the ship and he didn't even get his hair wet.
Jeez, that's nuts. And what, he found a lifeboat later on?
He was one of the ones that was made it over to the upside down lifeboat and was able to be pulled onto it. And so that's how he survived. Now, Charles Joffin is buried in New Jersey and died, I think, in 1958.
Now, was it accurate that, in the movie, they start with that woman just plays that uptight Biddy so well? I mean, you just hate her. You wish they threw her off that boat for a minute. but when they turn around and go back, because there's so much room on that boat, a lot of people at that point in time are literally frozen to death in the water. But then they obviously, I think that is when they find Rose when she blows that whistle. Did that happen?
They did go back. One boat did, and they were able to pull a few from the water that survived. Not many, less than 7.
And was the whole lifeboat thing, was that really a very I guess, underperforming actor? Was there a lot less lifeboats than they were on? Because I know Rose does like a quick calculation at the beginning. Was that accurate that they were way off on the number of boats?
The British Board of Trade, for a ship up to at a certain tonnage, had to have 16 lifeboats. That was the maximum classification. Titanic had 20, so it had 4 more than the required amount. Yes, Andrews envisioned having more, according to what that was in the movie, but they felt that the 20 was going to be sufficient, that anything they could avoid. So it had the 20 boats.
Okay.
So some of them were put out half filled. They really were. And they were having trouble at a couple of the stations getting people to come and get in the boats. They didn't want to get into them. They thought the ship was going to be fine. And by the time they realized it,
then it's too late.
It's too late.
Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this whole Jack and Rose thing, because as we've stated, that is, was a very fabricated, albeit brilliant part by Cameron, because that drags the women who in turns are going to drag their boyfriends and husbands. And even me, I'll be honest with you, I still love that movie. Just
an incredible movie.
Just as a fan.
I had a student walk in about April. It was still in the theaters for a long time, of course.
Yeah.
And she goes, "Coach, I'm going to see Titanic again tonight. How many times have you seen it?" And I told her I'd seen it about 7, I think. She said, "Tonight's going to be number 28 for me. I just love Jack, and I cry every time he dies." And she was about to start crying right there. And I'm going, "Well, you know that Jack is not real." And she says, "But I just love Jack." And she started to boohoo and right in front of me. And that's who the movie appealed to, is that audience.
Yeah.
Do you know who some of the executives wanted to be Jack?
No.
All right.
Oh, yeah. I did. Matthew McConaughey. I did hear that. Yeah.
Yes. I know I've got a bad impression, but I think the words may have helped a little bit.
Yeah. The words are key. And I was reading something where, I guess at the time, I mean, Leonardo was a pretty established actor. Obviously, that put him on another stratosphere, but I think he didn't want to read. And Cameron said, basically, you got to read this or you're not getting the part. I don't really care who you are.
Good for Cameron.
Yeah. I mean, he had to make sure he's going to be able to carry this, because that was a huge role.
They thought of different females for the Rose character, and one of them was Keira Knightley. Another was Nicole Kidman. And I actually like his choice. I thought Kate Winslet was a relatively unknown at the time. Nicole Kidman had already played in several roles, so we knew who she was. She had already had a defined character that she would play. Keira Knightley was a hero in a lot of different things, she was in the King Arthur movie. She was very, very good in it. But Winslet was able to initiate herself in that role, and totally believable.
I think too, because like you said, she was relatively unknown. It didn't take away from the story of the ship. I think had that been a Nicole Kidman established actor, people are going to be, I know not necessarily true to form, but they know her. They have a relationship. You know what I'm saying? So
Precisely.
It could take away from the backstory, the backdrop of the movie. So I think that was brilliant by him. You need one person to keep the focus, and that was Leo. The other person, obviously, she was there. She done a fantastic performance, but you don't want to overkill it by the characters. You don't want the characters to overshadow the movie itself.
And DiCaprio wasn't that big. He had done really well in Gilbert Grape and
Basketball Diaries he was in.
I think he had done a couple of small things. So he, like you said, he was not up in that stratosphere yet.
Right.
And I like the character of Billy Zane as Caledon Hockley.
Oh,
I
dude, he
like the movie
played
The
that.
Phantom. Nobody watched him play the Phantom, but he was in Tombstone. He was in a bunch of other things. But the one thing that I liked about Billy Zane was you wanted to hate Caledon Hockley because he was mean, he was snooty. Um, but there were times because of how he played the character that sometimes you feel sorry for him
Yeah.
because he just doesn't understand. And he was able to do that. And I just thought the casting was superb, really
Yeah.
was.
It was spot on for sure. And I definitely think there was room for two on that damn door or whatever it was they were laying on. I'm not that's a battle for another day.
Mythbuster says yes, Cameron says no.
There's a story that I heard you tell because we mentioned earlier the ship that did sink, then the ship that was turned into what was Olympus, the ship that was turned into the hospital, and then including the Titanic. There was actually a lady that was on all three of these.
Correct. The collision with the Olympic and the Hawk came several years while they were building Titanic.
Mhm.
And again, what happened was, here comes Hawk, or excuse me, here comes Olympic, and the Hawk comes in at an angle and sort of punctures like a can opener punctures a can. It had a little triangle wedge above the waterline. So Olympic had to go back and be fixed. But there was a stewardess on board named Violet Jessup, young lady. She has a book out. It's a very interesting book. It's a great read. And if you have any young listeners who need to do a book report or a project on a female hero, this is a great character, Violet Jessup, Jessup. So on board Titanic, she was a stewardess as well. And lo and behold, the first trip out on Titanic, it sinks. Violet Jessup is a female member of the crew. They put her in a boat to help take care of some of the other passengers. And she survived 2 of the White Star shipwrecks. Well, sometime later, when Britannic set sail as a hospital ship, she was now a nurse, and she was going down to help rescue wounded World War I soldiers. And as it's approaching Turkey, the area that it's going to Greece, off the island of Kea, Kea, it struck a mine and went down very quickly. Fortunately, on board were medical staff mostly and ship's crew, which was a skeleton crew because you didn't need all the victuals people. You didn't need that a cruise ship would have. So they went down with a skeleton crew and they were preparing to take on all these wounded casualties. And she survived the Britannic sinking. And I don't know about you, but I would have found a house somewhere in the middle of England
Yeah.
and bought it and stayed as far away from the ocean as I could after 3 shipwrecks.
I'm not even going fishing. Like I don't even want to go near the water. Like,
well, there are people who did survive Titanic. One family moved to Kansas, and why Kansas, they were asked at one time, and the one of the survivors' daughters said, mother wanted to get us as far away from the ocean as she could get.
Yeah.
So they went halfway across America. If they go any farther, they're near the Pacific. So they stopped in the middle of America to get. They would not ride any boats. They wouldn't go on ferries. They wouldn't get in a rowboat. Nothing like that.
Oh, I don't blame him a bit. I would have after 1, that would have been enough for me. Let alone this broad was on 3 and this happened.
Absolutely.
Now, another thing that's interesting here, when they started digging up, or not digging up, but resurfacing some of these artifacts, there was an interesting story that I heard you talk about on a podcast about Pearl Shuttle. Tell us that story, because this was just absolutely fascinating to me.
Artifacts can be recovered legally by one entity, and that's RMS Titanic Incorporated. This is court approved, court sanctioned, court overseen. In other words, the court still is supervisory of the wreck site. They still maintain a supervisory, role of what happens there.
And did they have to pay for that, right?
they had to go to court and do it, and they ended up having to pay Lloyd's of London because Lloyd's had the financial claim. They had to pay some other debts of some other people that were involved, but they had to chunk out a good, a lot of money to get to the point to claim those salvage rights. Now, for most ships, if it's in international waters, finders keepers. You can do whatever you want to with it. But the court and RMS Titanic had a hybrid agreement, is what it's called. It was a unique agreement. And what ends up happening is, number one, George Tulloch was the leader of the company at that time. George said that these artifacts need to be brought up and protected. They need to undergo conservation so that they won't just crumble and fall apart. The court agreed, and that was a definite positive step. Number two, George said, we don't want to sell these at auction. If you bought a piece of Titanic, where would you put it? You would put it on your mantle or on a desk, and nobody'd ever see it again unless you brought them over to your house to show you this piece. George said, we aren't going to sell the artifacts. We want to keep them as one collection. We don't want these to disappear in the hands of different people. The court liked that idea and agreed to that. And the third stipulation was that these artifacts would be put on display in museums, in exhibitions, so that this story could be told for years, and it would tell this story. I agree with all three of those. I support artifact recovery for those three reasons. I do not support bringing them up and selling them off to the highest bidder. So one of the things that they found was a large bag, and they brought this bag up, and it belonged to a man named Howard Irwin. Howard was a salesman. So in this Stetson bag, now understand that a leather bag, leather is treated with a chemical called tannin. You remember the expression tan your hide?
Yeah.
It usually meant something different than to treat the leather when I heard it.
Yeah.
We were
treated all right, treated badly.
It was a different treating if we got to that point. But the tannin helps preserve anything that's around it, specifically paper. So inside these leather valises and bags and suitcases, a lot of items are being preserved due to that tannin process. So they're able to open these bags. They found his sales catalogs. They found sheet music. They found clarinet. It was in bad shape, but they found the clarinet. They found a little music holder that they could put the music in while he was playing. But they also found some love letters from his fiancée named Pearl Shuttle. Now, the reason I got involved in this particular story is I had a friend who was working, and he was a part of the Titanic group, and his name was Dave Shuttle. And Dave had learned, he didn't care about Titanic from Adam's House Cat. He knew nothing about this story. He was a big New York Yankees fan. He'd turn over to watch the Yankees every night during baseball season. Loved the Yankees. And so one night he's turning the television over, and there's a picture on the television, and he stops and he looks at it and he goes, that's my Aunt Pearl. It was his family member. And he says, why is her picture on television? And all of a sudden he goes and he's watching this story, and Pearl Shuttle's letters were letters from his grandmother, his great aunt, I think was the official relationship, to Howard Irwin. And so he calls up the recovery group the next day, and he says, they were showing these pictures of Pearl Shuttle. That was my great aunt. And so they brought him in and they said, let's talk about these things. And he got to see the letters that his great aunt wrote in 1911 and 1912. And it was very emotional for him, and it was incredible. And Pearl's story ends up being very tragic. Howard's is most unique as well. They've written a book about it. Dave Shuttle, before he passed away. He had melanoma and sadly, passed away from that about 6 years ago. But he was almost a brother. I'd call him up and we'd talk about all the things Titanic, and we'd talk junk about his Yankees against my Braves, and just brotherly love
Yeah.
there between Dave Shuttle and myself. Um, it was very special for him to find out something about his great aunt. So those letters are still in the artifacts owned by the company.
Wow. Now, and wasn't there something where she actually thought that he died on the wreck?
He was listed on the passenger manifest, and for some reason did not make the voyage. The urban legend is that he was shanghaied,
Right.
taken on another boat somewhere. Um, a lot of people don't believe that's necessarily true, but he did not make the Titanic sailing. When the list of the survived came out, his name was not on the list, so he was presumed to be dead. And she ended up marrying someone else before he could get back.
Wow. How long was it before he was able to get back?
It took him a couple of months, I think, to get back.
Wow.
Urban legend was what I knew for the longest. And so I need to read more about what really happened.
Yeah.
And it's just a great story, though. It's just, and nobody would have known this had those letters not been found.
So what is your feeling here on this? Because I know a lot of people with a lot of documentaries, some of them feel that in essence, that is a graveyard. So some people have the belief of, leave it alone, do not disturb. Others have the thought process of kind of like what you mentioned earlier. If there are things that you can get up intact, put it in a museum. And I like that because it does keep alive, the memory, because if things aren't there to remind us, then we tend to forget. And that's including, loved ones that have passed on. You keep some sort of memento to keep them there, as a remembrance. And that's the same thing with situations like this. What is your thoughts on that? Which way do you lean?
I echo pretty much what you said. There are a lot of people who say it's a graveyard, leave it alone. End of story. One of the major historical groups in America called the recoverers ghouls, grave robbers. I've been called that because I support it. We've been called everything you can think of that starts with every letter of the alphabet, and some of them even twice. If we don't recover what's down there, it will be destroyed.
Right.
If we do not bring it up and take care of it, it disappears. There will be people down there think of a third-class passenger from Ireland. They had a bag that had all of their belongings in that bag. That was their entire life. It was everything that was important to them, and they were taking it to a new world to start a new life. That bag is still sitting in that room, if that room is intact.
Right.
Albert Caldwell had $100 in gold. He had taken it and put it in his bedside table, in the little table there. It's still there. If the table's gone, it fell straight down and it's laying there on the floor. There's so many examples of what's down there that can still tell stories. We recover a bag. The bag has so many different things in it. In the year 2000, they recovered a bag from a man named Adolf Saalfeld, Saalfeld, and he was a parfumier. And in that bag were vials, little glass vials, and they were perfume samples that he was bringing to America. As they're bringing it on board, one of those vials broke. It bumped the side of the ship, something cracked one of those vials. And everybody that's walking up to see what's in this large bin of things that they could smell what that smell was. That smell's been on the bottom of the ocean since 1912. So all those vials, we found out who Adolf Saalfeld was, and we have his history right there in those bags. We've got those perfume scents that we recovered. Charlotte Cardeza carried 27 steamer trunks with her. She did not want to use the linens and the pillows of White Star. She brought her own, and her maid would change the beds and put her own personal linens and pillows up. But in a lot of those things will be all of her gowns, all of the items she was bringing back to America with her, and they're easily accessible. They are in a place that they can be recovered.
Wow.
And, I know I'm glamorizing it, but all those things will be destroyed. And imagine recovering 8 of her suitcases, 8 of her trunks, steamer trunks. This was Charlotte Cardazza. That's the only way to tell that story.
And to me, I mean, I guess I can see where people are coming from. But at the same time, you want a remembrance of something. Obviously, it's way past time where you can, the bodies that were recovered, that's about all you're going to get in lieu of a body. But that would replicate to me some version, if not even a greater extension of like a tombstone for a person after they've passed away. That is their, vigil that people can remember them by. The ship as a whole, for those that can't be remembered, that there wasn't anything to grab. But like you said, in her case, her dresses would be, her remembrance of her tombstone in a sense.
It would be a visual representation of a story.
Yes.
And when you hear a story and you see a story,
it triggers.
It's much more impactful. And again, I support it for preservation and exhibition, not for sales.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it needs to be, because like you said, if some quasi-billionaire, if Elon Musk wants to buy it and put it in his dining room, nobody's going to see it except who he invites over there. And to me, that's doing no benefit, because nobody's going to be able to see that and learn about it.
Absolutely. And then you have to look at a second argument to the discussion. And I mean, argument in terms of a debate argument is there were very few bodies inside the ship. There were some. There's no doubt that some people did not leave the ship.
Yeah.
But a lot of them were on the deck when the ship went under and were in that floating field of humans. And so you have to understand it's also in a bed where there's a large concentration of calcium carbonate. And so the water is slightly it's overcompensated with calcium carbonate, which causes decay faster in bones.
Now, when you guys bring up pieces like that one behind you, I'm assuming there has to be some sort of process to get the salt out and start some sort of preservation.
This underwent conservation for quite a while to preserve it. The first thing, you're right, you have to get the salt crystals out of the iron matrix,
right?
The lattice structure of it. And what they did was put it in a large pool. And in essence, they run deionized water over it, or distilled water, clean water. And it soaks in the clean water. And as it drains out, it's draining out salty water because the salt is being removed. They just keep replacing the fresh, pouring out the old, and they do that for a long time. And then what this piece has had done to it is they covered it with a protective covering. I don't know the exact components of it. The man who did the conservation of this piece is Joe Simbrat, and he will be at our conference in August, and he's going to tell us what they had to do to it. I do know that the original piece was brilliant orange when it came up, and it had yellows, and it had browns, and it had reddishes, all different colors like that. And the more it stayed in the oxygen, the oxidation process hits this piece, and it looked like it was, a car that's been in a pasture for like 40 years. It turned bright rust. And so they had to take the rust off, and then they sealed it with some type of a chemical sealer. And that sealer stops things from getting into it. And those people know what they're doing. They're experienced at it. And this piece should last for some time.
Fascinating stuff. What what do you think took so long to actually find it? Because that was a huge gap to the time they found it when that thing went under. I mean, was it just technology? Nothing could be able to go to that depth. I mean, what do you think took so long to actually find it?
Didn't look for it. They
Really?
had only a limited number of expeditions who had a design to go and look for Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
Jack Grimm was a Texas A&M person. He was an big oil man down in Texas. He sent several expeditions out to try to find it. The Ballard expedition was really not to find Titanic. The Ballard expedition was really to find the Scorpion and the Thresher submarines. But because they were in that same area, they said, we're going to look for Titanic. And they would do a little bit of both at the same time. And then they had a major find when they found Titanic. It is believed that one of the first ships to have located it was the HMS Hecate, Hecate, Hecate. But nothing was ever made of what they reported. So, that's not a legal claim if they don't follow up on it and say, yeah, this is what this is. They saw an image.
The emotions of being the ones to find that probably had to be off the charts, I would imagine.
Two of our guests, we hope that will be at the conference. One has already expressed interest. Let's see. One of them is Tom Detweiler. He's expressed interest in being at the conference. The other that we're trying to secure is William Lang. Both of those were on duty the night it was discovered. And we hope for a presentation first is for these two very, very reputable people to tell us how they felt that night.
I can see you're costing me plane tickets to come back out there for this conference, because this is very interesting stuff. And I'm not even really one that's a huge history buff, but I think with everything surrounding this, it's been one of those things that's fascinated me. And I apologize for keeping you this long, but when you got somebody that's as knowledgeable as you want to take advantage of it.
No worries, no worries. I've done probably over 500 presentations in the 25 years since the expedition. Wow. I've talked to school groups. I've talked to adult groups. I've gone to retirement facilities where there's, retirement living. All of them still have people that are just as interested as you've been, and some even more so. I get a 7-year-old that stands up, and when I ask him if he had a question, he goes, "It should be left alone. Those are graves." And everybody in the whole place goes to turn to look at me to see how I'm going to respond to this 7-year-old. He's about maybe 8 or 9, I guess. He was a small fella compared to the rest of the audience. And is this guy going to blow him this little kid out of the water? How's he going to do it? So I had to use a little psychology, and I popped up a picture of an artifact. Told him what the artifact was. I said, "That looks cool, doesn't it?" He goes, "Yeah." And then I clicked again, and I showed him something else. "Wow." And I showed him something else. And I said, "Now, if we would have left it alone, you would never see those. We won't be able to bring those up and take pictures of them." I said, "Do you like those pictures?" And he says, "Yeah." And I said, "You have to think about that." And his mother was going, "Whew." So I was very gentle with that young person.
Yeah, gentleman made a great point.
Absolutely. Well, I've had people argue with me that Jack and Rose were real. and Hollywood, they're absolutely Hollywood. And
now, one thing that I was going to ask, like, what exactly, because I know not everybody has the capability. How deep is Titanic from the top of the water?
Based on the tide, it can be anywhere from 3,800 feet to 3,800 meters to 4,000 meters. That's 2.5 miles.
Right.
It does fluctuate sometimes with the tide. The ROV will be at different heights every time you see a picture of the ROV down on the bottom of the ocean. 2.5 miles. The pressure down there, your tire has a pressure of about 42 pounds per square inch. On the bottom of the ocean, it's approximately 6,200 pounds per square inch.
Jeez.
It's I tell my students, or I tell people I do presentations to, take the back of your hand and put a postage stamp. That's about a square inch. And then put 2 cars on that postage stamp. Then put another stamp and put 2 cars and put another postage. Fill every piece of skin with postage stamps and 2 cars. And I said, that'll give you an idea of what the pressure's like.
It's crazy.
And about the only thing they can understand is dive into the deep end of a pool and feeling the weight pushing on their chest if they happen to go down to about a 12-foot pool. 6-foot pool, it doesn't work too well. But if you've been scuba diving and you've gone down to the first thermocline, 33 feet, you can feel it as you get deeper and deeper. You just have to make sure you acclimatize, that you get your body used to it. You can't just power dive down to that depth. You just got to let your body get used to it.
And same thing coming back up, you have to avoid getting what's it called, the bends.
Nitrogen narcosis, the bends.
Yeah.
Nitrogen bubbles will get bigger as the pressure gets less. And so it develops these nitrogen bubbles in your bloodstream. And it affects your brain.
So what exactly would stop some freelancer with more money than he's got sense to go out there and start just fooling around Titanic, for his own pleasure? Because obviously you don't have armed guards sitting out there in the water, waiting. What exactly would prevent somebody from doing that?
There was a court case by a man named Haver. Haver wanted to go out and look and take pictures. And the company defended their position, saying as salver, they believe that includes the visual rights as well as the recovery rights. Haver argued that. It went to an appellate decision, and the appellate court decided that RMS Titanic Inc. is the only people that can recover, but others can go down and can look. They're just not supposed to touch.
Okay.
Now, the bad part about that is what you just mentioned. Somebody gets money to go down there. Who's going to be down there to police whether or not they touch anything? There are artifacts that are missing. There's a photograph from Bob Ballard's videos of a statue called the Artemis. It's a beautiful statue. I've got a replica of it up over here on my mantle. But this Artemis was photographed laying on the ground. Now, Ballard did not recover it. I am not implying that Ballard did it all. But when Tulloch went out there, they have never found the Artemis. So somebody did take the Artemis. There was only one expedition to go between the two, and it is believed that one of those people have that on their mantle, and it's in his home. It's what it's believed. I've never been in the home, so I can't tell you his name and tell you for sure, but we have a good idea who has that piece. In 2002, I investigated rumors that there was an illegal expedition to the wreck site. It's called the Rogue Expedition. I have pictures of them on the dock, and I have emails from members of that group who admit that they did recover artifacts illegally. And the purpose was they were trying to usurp control of the artifacts from the Norfolk Admiralty Court, who oversees the wreck, take it to a different court where they would argue that they have the right to sell anything and everything. And that's what their attempt was to do. It got ugly. It got legal. It was really complicated. The people who participated in the illegal expedition deny all knowledge and existence of it, while members of the expedition tell us everything that happened.
Could that be like, could they face legal recourse from that?
That is legally piracy, violating the Norfolk laws. If they were in America, they could be brought up on those. But the leaders of this group are not American.
Work around.
When you and I meet together, I'll show you all those pictures, and I'll show you a video. The BBC sent a team over to talk to me about it. And they said, well, Bill, we find these claims to be very suspicious. Can you prove what you've said? I wrote a letter to the court. It was like 72 pages with emails, photographs. I even sent a CD with a copy of the photographs on it for a digital record, and hard copy pictures. Put them in nice little photo sleeves. Items were numbered, had little item A, item B, item C that I referred to. I really made a nice presentation out of it, and the court accepted it, and that's what the BBC heard about. So they said, "Can we see your documents? Can you give us a copy?" So I went down, made copies of everything. They gave me their account number. I put it in FedEx, and FedEx overnighted it to London, to the London Times. And they called me back 2 days later and they went, "Wow, everything you've said, you've got evidence for. And you've not only done that, but you've referenced, you've got footnotes to your
Right.
evidence." And so they sent a team over to interview me at my house in South Carolina. And then they researched some more in England to some of the leads that I gave them, and came up with a huge story that was on page 1 and page 2 of the London Times back in those days.
Wow.
And the bad part about this, there was a hostile takeover of the company in 1999 around Thanksgiving. And the person that I worked with was ousted by a new management group that wanted to sell the artifacts. The people that made tons of money were the attorneys trying to argue that they should have the right to sell.
Oh,
End
yeah.
of story. We don't want to argue this, but that's what our right should be. And the court kept saying, "Sorry, you're not going to get the rights." It even went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with the appellate court that the decisions in place would remain intact. When I investigated the takeover, I found 18 violations of SEC law. So I wrote a letter to the Security and Exchange Commission asking them to investigate this. It was a public company at that time. And so they interviewed me for about 6 hours one day and asked questions. They had copies of my evidence. They had cassette tape copies of interviews I had done. And they launched an investigation. And as soon as that was discovered, I was sued 2 times in American court for $1 million each time.
Jeez.
And so, this turnip doesn't have any blood. They can squeeze all they want to.
Wow.
But it was really funny as I went up there for a hearing on the case. There's a law in New York that says when a case is dropped after so many days, both sides have to agree to the dropping of the case. And my attorney said, "Let's take a chance. All they've done in here is just keep filing these bogus motions to run up your attorney's fees."
Yeah.
And they were significant. They were, about $40,000 roughly. And, I was going to work to pay them the rest of my life, I guess. 40 grand's almost a mortgage.
Yeah.
So he said, "Let's challenge it. Let's ask it. We will agree to drop the case if they pay for your attorney's fees." And they said, "No, we're not going to do that." So I flew up after Labor Day for a hearing. So I'm sitting there and I've got a suit with a tie. And the hearing was going to be at the judge's bench. It wasn't going to be the Perry Mason courtroom, where you've got, "Tell us the truth. You can't," it's not one of those situations. It was all going to happen at the judge's bench. So I'm sitting there, and the judge, whose name was Diane Lebedev, great wisdom. I researched her, and she makes very good decisions, in my opinion. She made a real good one in my case. But she called me up there, and I go up and I said, "Yes, ma'am. Your Honor, ma'am." And she said, "We're going to let you be up here for this since you've come all the way from the Carolinas." I said, "Thank you, ma'am. Your Honor." And she laughed and she said, "I can tell you're from the Carolinas. Mr. Willard, you may call me ma'am if you like. You may call me Your Honor if you like. I'll thank you for that bit of courtesy that we don't get much up here." And I did Your Honor, ma'am, is how I did it from that moment on. But our attorneys are dressed in these beautiful gray suits. They got their leather portfolios. They may be Armani. I don't know what they were. They were really nice. And the other attorney is sitting there with Docksiders and no socks, khakis, Jimmy Buffett shirt down that's open up right above his belly button. He's got his gold bling. And where my guys have their Armani jacket, he's got a rolled up newspaper. And he was caught in a fib. And once the judge found out about the fib, it was easy. It was at that point. She decided in favor of us. She said this lawsuit had no merit from the beginning. It was just a case to intimidate. She found in our favor for the attorney's fees asked.
Wow.
Oh, no, we're not happy about that. They bless their hearts. That's all I can say. Bless their hearts.
I'm glad that worked out for you. I'm glad you were able to come on the show. I'm going to let you get on out of here, man. But in closing, there was I don't know if it was something you guys were doing, but at the time, I guess the time that it went under, you were doing some sort of presentation, something somewhere, and you guys kind of had like a moment of silence and remembrance at that time. And you said that it was really emotional for you. Do you remember what I'm referring to?
I know that we were at the wreck site, and the first night we were there, we all went out about 11:30, and we were wide awake. You know, we were adrenaline hyped, um, and we looked out across the water, and it was Cameron depicted that same image, the moon reflecting off the bouncing waves.
Yeah.
And we could see that image, and we were thinking, you know, we said to each other, "This is when it struck the iceberg." And it was quiet. And a little later on, it got to be about 2:20, and it became very quiet. And somebody said, "Right about now, right over there, that is where Titanic sank." And we could almost envision in our mind's eye the bodies in the water, the people in the water scrambling and trying to ask for help. We'd all seen the Cameron movie, so that gave us a visual model to follow.
Mm-hmm.
But to be there at that time, though it was not on the actual day that it occurred, it was still at that time, was extremely overwhelming. A lot of people were emotional. I was. Um, every time we do a conference, we always have a moment of silence at the end, play Nearer My God to Thee. Um, what we do, what I've done is the expeditions to recover the big piece is in a book called Our Story, celebrating the 20th anniversary of the 1998 Titanic expedition. And in that, different people share their feelings at the same event, how they felt at that time. Um, Anybody that wants to read a great true story about what happened at that with the expedition, that's there. My website is voyagesexplorertitanic.com, and it's got different projects that I've been involved with. It does have our Titanic Conference 23 listed there. People can message me and with questions if they have them. But we'd love to have you come join us at that conference. We're going to, you know, if we can get 6 of the actors from the movie for that third day, that's going to be incredible. Yeah. And then have the expedition members the other 2 days share about that piece and humanity and the above human efforts that went into getting it. That's going to be a special 3 days.
Yeah, it sounds amazing, man. And we wish you luck putting that together. I hope it's a great success. We'll put that link in the show notes for our listeners and viewers to go look at. We'll put this out on audio, video as well. So, you know, get it in front of many eyes and ears as possible. And I'll close out with this. There's that poem that Bill Paxton recited, and I'm not sure. I think was it Robert Fisk that wrote it? You probably know which one I'm referring to, but said each man stood post while the weaker ones went by, showing once more to the world how an Englishman should die. Was that written from somebody there or somebody after the fact?
After the fact.
After the fact. That's very powerful. That whole poem is very powerful. Well, man, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming by. You dropped a lot of knowledge on me. Again, I hate keeping guests past an hour, but I mean, I was really into this. I hope I brought some good questions to you because I know you probably get asked a lot of the same stuff, but I try to do my due diligence and bring different stuff to the table. So hope it wasn't too redundant for you, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming by.
It's an honor, and I appreciate it very much. And let me say one thing, Titanic is still in the theaters. If this is aired while it's still out there, you know, go see it at the theater. This means watching it on an enormous field in front of you of a movie screen is tremendously different from watching it on some little television across the room and on your phone even, and you don't get the same effects. And, you know, I may have seen it the last time it'll come out in my lifetime at a theater. But I had to go one more time to pay tribute to not only my family member that was on board, but I tell this, that I know these passengers because of 40 years plus of research, some of them better than I know members of my own family, you know, some of my extended family. And I talk to those descendants like they're cousins and brothers. And it's as if there's a specialness that draws people to that ship.
Oh, it's definitely is. Well, folks, like you said, go out and check Titanic if you have that availability in your local theaters. Check out this episode of Crime and Entertainment. We're on the audio side of things as well. And we hope everybody, if you can make it, go out and check out this seminar they're going to put on out there in Vegas. What hotel is it going to be at? Luxor?
The Luxor. They can find details on the website, voyagesexplorertitanic.com.
That sounds good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am Hollywood Wade. That was Titanic expert Bill Willard. And unfortunately, we are out of time. Bill, we appreciate you stopping by the show, my friend.
It's an honor. Thank you, Wade.